energy attribute tracking. The standard is supported by lots of organizations, including some of the world's leading sustainability players. And Killian is going to share some thoughts with us about emissions associated with 24/7 CFE procurement. And then we'll have an opportunity for lots of Q&A with him. So I encourage you to put questions in the chat or save them and be ready to use the raise hand feature when he's finished. And with that, over to you, I think, Killian.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and to everyone at RAP for this opportunity. Yes, so I'm going to basically present a bit of a framework for how to think about emissions when we talk about 24/7 CFE tariffs. As a bit of a disclaimer, this is a topic that we could discuss for months, and I have been discussing now for years. So please do forgive me if you are aware of some of these concepts already, but I think it's really important to set a kind of a basic framework that we all can use as a basis for these discussions, and then obviously Neil will kind of get more into the details of some of the challenges around this later on in the session. So first of all, just a little word about EnergyTag. So it's like a global granular tracking harmonization initiative. It was founded in April of 2020. We had a white paper launched in May of 2021. And then last year, we published our standard and guidelines, which basically sets forth a series of criteria and recommendations about how to do hourly energy tracking. Today, we normally do annual or monthly. And so we brought together, as was mentioned already, some of the leading experts there to put together this standard and guidelines. And at the moment, we're actually auditing some schemes to do this hourly matching and tracking. We also have a series of projects within EnergyTag that are demonstrating that the technology for this exists and works well. And we also do a bit of policy work, sharing information about, what we're doing, what the updates are in terms of energy tracking, both in the US and Europe. For example, we've been working a lot on the clean or green hydrogen topics, both in the United States for the Inflation Reduction Act 45V tax credit, and in the European Union for the Renewable Hydrogen Delegated Acts there, where, talking about 24/7 accounting and emissions accounting, hourly tracking is really central to those discussions. These are some of the organizations that support our standards. Go to our website. It's all there in the publication section. I invite you to read them if you're brave enough. There's quite a lot of detail. A lot of major US stakeholders have been involved there since the beginning as well. About half of our advisory board, including the likes of Google, Microsoft, Emirates, AES, is US based. So this is really, even if we're based in Europe, the core team, this is very much a global initiative. So where do electricity emissions come from? Very basically, they come from the grid. So if you're connected to the grid consuming megawatt hours, by default, you count your emissions based on the grid average. So like whatever the overall generation of that grid you're located is on, you basically take all the emissions there, divide by all the megawatt hours, and that gives you what we call your emissions factor. So that would be like your pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. And you basically take the grid average as a kind of a default position. All the CFE, all the fossil, everything in there. That's the, let's say, starting point of how we think about emissions when we think about what are the emissions of my electricity supply. However, obviously, many of you will be familiar with the concept of contracting for specific emissions attributes. So this concept has existed now for a number of decades, where you can specifically purchase through contracts the right to claim, for example, zero emissions electricity, as demonstrated by energy attribute certificates, or RECs, as we refer to them in the United States, IRECs internationally. So that's the common term there in the US is REC, but that just means that I've actually paid money to claim the zero carbon, usually attribute of electricity or renewable electricity. So that's the basic framework. There's many nuances to this. but I think that's the basic thing to keep in mind here, is that, you know, you have a grid mix that is delivered to you by default, or you can go out and specifically procure via contracts the right to claim CFE, carbon-free electricity production. When we think about 24/7 tariffs, there's a slight nuance that is introduced. So energy attribute certificates typically track on a monthly or annual basis, and usually over a continent. When we think about 24/7 tariffs, usually we're thinking about more granular types of accounting. So you're buying contracts, of course. This is all about contracting for CFE resources every hour, usually on the same grid. These are two key concepts that most CFE 24/7 buyers are looking for. Using granular certificates. So like granular certificates are basically just part of the energy attribute certificate family, but they're time-stamped. Okay, so you know the hour or a half hour, depending on what's being issued, but at least the hour of energy production. And that's a piece of information you do not have today on a rec. And that's the same all around the world. Typically, you don't have the time of production, which actually makes it not the right instrument to do a 24/7 type tariff. For that, we need granular certificates, which is basically a time-stamped energy attribute certificate. There's also two ways of looking at emissions that we hear about a lot. So there's attributional emissions, which is the emissions associated with the production of supplied energy. So actual measurable emissions from the production of electricity. And there's also another metric that is called consequential emissions, which is basically a modeled estimate of the change in system emissions because of an intervention. In this case, because you bought energy, then, you know, I caused this, this change in overall grid emissions. For the purposes of this discussion and for 24/7 tariffs in general, we use attributional accounting. I can get more into detail on that in a bit, but that's the important thing to keep in mind here, because that really is the type of accounting that makes sense for 24/7 CFE, because you're buying zero carbon attributes of the electricity produced and having them attributed to you. And if you do that every hour on the same grid, then you end up being at zero. That is different to buying a potential offset of emissions that you've caused on the grid based on kind of a modeled number. So the type of accounting we're looking at here is attributional carbon accounting. Is hourly tracking available in the US? So, you know, the standard systems are annual matching. Two of the biggest US registries, so RECs or EACs, are operated by things called REC registries. Basically companies who issue, transfer, and cancel these certificates. And two of them now are actually offering already hourly tracking or granular certificate tracking. MRETS offers it basically across most of the US already on a voluntary basis, even outside its compliance zones. And obviously PJM, their GAT system, also offers hourly tracking as of today. And I know a number of other registries are actively working on that also. Obviously, the EnergyTag standard can help to harmonize this. We do believe in standards. Obviously, we do believe that it's going to be easier for consumers to operate in these markets if it's done in a harmonized and standardized way. And when they buy a GC, well, it basically means the same thing whether you're buying it in Washington or Florida or New York. And if it does mean something different, then these markets will obviously suffer from a kind of a friction that isn't desirable. So just to give a very quick example of what an emissions calculation actually looks like. This is a bit of a scary equation, but it's actually a very simple one. All that it means is to calculate your emissions, you just need to know your load in a given hour. What's your megawatt hours consumed between, let's say, 1 and 2 p.m., for example, and what were the emissions factors in that hour and at that location as well. So time here is obviously time, our hour, and location is the physical location, and that will give you your emissions. So when we're talking about emissions factors, factors, there's a certain hierarchy you use. So if you have granular certificates and they're from a CFE source, then you count at 0. If emissions then are coming from the grid, so as we discussed at the beginning, if it's kind of that default power, you don't have a specific contract, then you will, if that's available, account for it at a thing called the residual mix, which basically is the average mix in your region with all of the granular certificates given to other organizations removed. So there's no double counting. In the absence of a residual mix, then you use the grid average. That's basically the simple hierarchy of how we think about what emissions factor we use when doing the calculation for emissions in a given hour. Load, some of your load obviously is going to be covered by contracts, so covered by granular certificates. In this example, between 10 and 11 p.m., we say 7 megawatt hours is covered by GCs, and then there's 3 that we have no contracts for. So we must account for that at the residual mix of the grid, or again at the average if the residual is not available. So we have our megawatt hours here, and we also have the relative volumes of contracted and non-contracted energy, and that basically gives us our emissions for this hour. Okay, so that's a simple calculation. You multiply megawatt hours by pounds per megawatt hour, and that gives you pounds of CO2. You just repeat this calculation for every hour of the year, and that will give you your yearly emissions from a 24/7 type tariff. Obviously, if it's a full 100% 24/7 tariff, then your GCs are going to cover this bar will be blue for every hour, right? You'll have contracts covering all of your load, and obviously then you will have a 0 emissions claim using hourly accounting. Just to maybe wrap up before we can go to some questions from Jessica, just to highlight again, like why we're doing this, I suppose. Today we typically have RE 100 type tariffs, so 100% annual. That's been great. It's got a lot of renewables built, but obviously it forgets things like flexibility. You can be 100% renewable without having any storage in your portfolio, still relying quite a bit on gas balancing or other fossil balancing, for example. So we're not incentivizing flexibility and storage with these tariffs. With hourly, you obviously are. You're thinking about flexibility, you're thinking about every hour of the year. And obviously geography comes into it more as well, whereas with RE 100, it's more continental and like a North American type boundary where you can contract for renewables in Florida to claim in California. With a 24/7 tariff, we tend to look for deliverable electricity coming from the same grid. That might be the same balancing authority, for example. So I hope that that's been useful in setting up a kind of a framework for how we have these discussions together over this session and over the coming months. So maybe I'll pass it back to yourself, Jessica, if you have any questions for me.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Killian. I was just wondering if you could I want to sort of reiterate for everyone this last point that you were making, which is why we need 24/7 matching and why the RE 100 or annual matching of 100% renewables isn't good enough. If you could just reiterate some of those reasons.
Sure. If your supplier is supplying you with physical energy, that's obviously happening on a more or less real-time basis, or if we take like a typical market settlement here in Europe, it maybe be 15 minutes. Basically, RE 100 or 100% annual matching allows you to take renewables from a time of abundance, so when there's lots of sun, for example, and to use those renewables, let's take in California, for example, so take attributes from the middle of the day, and then basically to take those RECs and to use them during the nighttime to also remain with 100% renewable supply over the 24-hour period, even if in reality what you're being delivered physically in that hour is not obviously not solar energy, right? Like it's not possible unless you do storage to consume solar energy at nighttime. So if we have an accounting system like that with this flaw, it basically removes the incentive for markets, for consumers to actually go out and contract for storage. For example, in this California case, with hourly accounting to be 100% renewable or 100% CFE. Well, then during the nighttime, they're going to have to find carbon-free energy, whether that be from, I don't know, geothermal, whether that be from building a battery and storing the renewables from the daytime. That's what the grid actually needs. Being 100% annually renewable, it gets you a part of the way there. But ultimately, once you're 100%, you're probably going to stop. You're going to stop your energy transition once you're at 0 or 100. And the issue today is that the metrics that we're using are not properly representing the full journey that we need to go on, so that the grid itself gets to a deep or full decarbonization.
Great, thank you. I just want to acknowledge questions coming in the chat, and we will get to those. Thank you for submitting them. My second question for you is, when you're accounting for CFE, do you count the existing carbon resources on the grid or only new resources?
That is, if that depends on the buyer's preference right now, right? If you look at the carbon-free energy compact, so the 24/7 compact, they have 5 principles. So this is the one run by the UN, Sustainable Energy for All, with like 110 signatories. They have a principle around, obviously, hourly matching, deliverability, and encouraging new supply. Obviously, we need more clean energy. We need more new clean energy. However, some buyers, prefer to include only new, and some others, find it fine to contract existing resources. There's no, agreed standard on that yet.
Okay.
So that question is still an open one, and I think a really good and valid one.
Okay, great, thank you. Nancy, do you have a couple questions?
Yes, Jess, thanks. And Killian, thank you for the presentation. My first question goes back to attributional and consequential accounting. And could you reiterate the differences between those again and explain whether you think one is more suitable to 24/7 and why? Because I think that's a key point we're hoping to come to agreement on today.
Sure. Yeah. So fundamentally what attributional accounting tries to do is take all of the emissions from production and allocate them to all of the consumption in a given time period. So that's the fundamental mechanism. In the context of a 24/7 tariff, it obviously, if you're purchasing attributes, these are unique attributes, and you're having them retired in your name, then you and only you can claim that CFE. That's how these market-based accounting mechanisms work. And obviously, as the purpose of a 24/7 tariff is to deliver zero carbon, electricity produced with zero carbon to the consumer on an hourly basis, this is the type of accounting that naturally emerges from the basic procurement or supply approach. Consequential accounting is different in that it tries to estimate the emissions changes on the grid because of an intervention. So, obviously there's a counterfactual analysis that has to happen. It's like, I've taken this action and the grid emissions are now this. If I had not taken this action, the grid emissions would have been this. So it's a very different approach, and it's obviously something that cannot actually be measured. You can't put a meter somewhere and measure that. You have to do a modeling analysis. It's not to say that this is not a useful number for decision making, for seeing where we site plants, etc. But it's definitely complex in terms of attributional accounting using energy attribute certificates. typically the information on an energy attribute certificate is kind of more or less fact-based. It's it's the time of production, it's the source of energy, it's the location of energy. It's not a kind of a modeled number that is used to estimate a potential change in system emissions. That would require further thought about how that number would be calculated. Today, there's no standard available for actually calculating consequential emissions. So, I think there's kind of a couple of things there in terms of using this for accounting that would need to be addressed first. And obviously, naturally, attributional accounting of zero carbon energy to a consumer. That is the point of a 24/7 tariff. That is literally its definition. And therefore, this is the right type of accounting to use when we're conveying to the consumer, well, what's the emissions of your electricity supply.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful in clarifying and reiterating. So since we're fortunate that you're zooming in from the EU, wanted to ask a question about the landscape there. What's happening generally, obviously, big picture in the EU on 24/7. How does it compare to where we are and what we're doing here? Not necessarily just in this project, perhaps. And what have been some of the challenges in the EU that you think could help us in the US? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, no, but it's a great question. Clearly, the hydrogen question has transformed how people are thinking about 24/7 in the EU and has accelerated enormously the whole movement and the whole ecosystem. So the EU published its rules a couple of months ago for renewable hydrogen, and basically to qualify hydrogen as renewable after a transition phase, you'll have to do hourly matching, you'll have to do deliverability, and you'll have to prove new supply. So this is basically the 3-pillar rules that they've adopted in Europe. So now it's in law. The EU has very aggressive hydrogen targets, that are going to require hundreds of terawatt hours of 24/7 electricity delivery to electrolyzers. So it's really liftoff now. The markets here are basically figuring out, how do we do this? How do we deliver these volumes? How do we get the tracking in place? So there's a huge amount of energy and progress. I would say, especially over the last 6 months on 24/7. A lot of that has been driven by hydrogen, but not only. There's also different voluntary initiatives, different governmental mandates as well. The Irish government, for example, is looking at 24/7 requirements for placing of data centers. So there's a lot of interesting things happening. There's also general updates of the European tracking systems. So our energy attribute certificates, they're being changed and becoming more granular as well. I think in terms of what the US can learn. First of all, on the registry side, actually the US is actually advancing quite quickly. So the likes of Emirates and PJM have moved quickly, offering hourly tracking now across a lot of the US. The EU has a more rigid regulatory framework, meaning that hourly tracking is going to take a bit longer to do there with the guarantee of origin. So with our standard instrument, there's obviously still ways of doing it anyway. But with the standard instrument, it's going to take longer than the US. I think some things that maybe Europe has been doing that maybe the US could learn from is common standards. So the EU has common standards for EACs or RECs. We have a residual mix calculation at a kind of a federal level as well. I think that would be very, very useful in the United States to enable these tariffs. And yeah, just general coordination between the REC systems really helps, especially as we add complexity with emissions data, with calculations of things like residual mixes. I think that kind of coordination would be really helpful in the US, and it's something that we've had in Europe probably for the last decade or so.
That's great. I noticed we were wandering a little bit over into solutions, and I know as Dave admonished us to challenges, but I'm sure it's partly the way I asked the question. But it sounds like there is a lot for us to learn. Could you learn from the EU, and perhaps things the EU could take?
Absolutely. I was just at a meeting this morning, actually, with with the European wind and solar industries. There was folks from the US on the call as well, from some of the big corporates there, from WRI, discussing actually 24/7 contracts. Like, you know, one challenge I think we need to think about, and this has probably been covered a lot here as well, it's like, you know, standardizing contracts, taking the friction out of these deals. You know, a lot of the work we've done with like things like annual PPAs or annual tariffs, that's like 80% of the work, or 90% even in most cases. A lot of the contractual terms won't change, but there's going to be nuances we need to think about. You know, what happens if you don't deliver the attributes in the right hour? Before that didn't matter, now it does. So that's definitely one kind of challenge, to go to the challenges that I think this group can also think about and you know, coordinate with what is happening in Europe, because there's an initiative being launched there on kind of standardization of these 24/7 contracts. And I think that's definitely something that is really encouraging from this group, to get things right on terms of standards from day one, because otherwise you have a fragmentation, and it ultimately just gets more confusing for consumers, which is not what we need.
Oh, that sounds like a perfect fit with this project. Standard contract terms. Great. I think, thank you for answering those for me and Jess's questions as well. I think, Jess, do we want to go to questions in the chat now?
Yeah. In the interest of time, Killian, I'm going to combine some questions and throw them at you all together. So bear with me. There's a number of comments and questions related to the residual mix in the chat. So one of the challenges of what you're discussing is being able to calculate the grid residual mix. One of the questions is, do you track RECs or claims associated with the residual and average mix and account for that? Another question is your thoughts on using the marginal emissions rate for attributional accounting.
Jess, I would note before Killian answers that these are also issues that Neil is going to discuss, but certainly getting Killian's perspective is valuable.
Yeah, sure. So I can touch on them briefly. Just on the residual mix, you know, in Europe, there is a residual mix calculated for each country. I know that CRS do something as well in the US for green RECs, so it's not quite all RECs. The basic mechanism there is you take all production, let's say in a year, because today's residual mixes are in a year. You take all production in a year, all megawatt hours, all emissions from that production, and then that gives you the average mix. You divide those two numbers, and then you subtract all RECs from that, basically, right? Like, so you subtract all energy that has been contractually allocated to someone else, and then the residual is what, you know, no one else has claimed, basically. So that is I hope I've understood that question correctly, but that's the basic mechanism there. Obviously, an hourly residual mix does that exact thing, but just at an hourly level and not at an annual level. So like, we're actually currently working on how you do that on an hourly level, using a few case studies in Europe, with obviously working with some partners on that. And yeah, it's advancing quite well, actually. So there are going to be methodologies pretty soon to do residual mix calculations on an hourly level also. Ultimately, what we would need is a coordinated, all registry coordinated system, where granular certificates are basically removed from the average mix every hour in a given grid region. On the second question, what do I think of using marginal emissions factors for attributional accounting? I think, well, it's not really what I think. I think, you know, if you look at some of the research on this, so there's 2 peer-reviewed papers at the moment. So looking at this question, NREL have a number of publications, happy to share them afterwards. We won't get too into the weeds, but a little bit. You know, basically what matters about when you think about consequential emissions, what actually matters is the long-term outcome of your intervention. You know, that's what really matters. It's the long-run outcome of your intervention. And so that for that, we need a thing called long-run marginal emissions factors, and they best estimate what your impact is going to be. Using short-run marginal emissions factors can, according to NREL, overestimate what your actual long-term impact is. So if you're referring to using short-run marginal emissions factors, based on at least NREL's analysis, also Princeton have done analysis on this, I would be, you know, I would be cautious about the effectiveness of that as you know, a kind of a deep decarbonization strategy. I think there's still questions there. And then obviously, as I discussed already, if we're going to use them, if those questions were resolved, then in any case, we would have to have a standardized method for calculating marginal emissions, because it's based on a counterfactual modeling. So there'd have to be a standard method. And we'd also have to have an attributional accounting mechanism, because you know, the marginal plant, so the last plant to dispatch, obviously not all consumers can claim to have, you know, avoided it being dispatched. Then you would have a double counting issue. And the number one rule of attributional accounting is no double counting. So we'd have to think about an accounting framework that would kind of make that work if we were going to use marginal emissions. I know Neil's going to touch on some of these topics later on as well. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. I do want to squeeze in one more for you before we go to Neil, because it's directly relevant to your EU
Sure.
experience. Did the regulators in the EU have any major concerns when EnergyTag rolled out, and how did they overcome them? Is any regulatory or legislative body requiring 24/7 for voluntary products?
So basically, EnergyTag, you know, the folks who set up EnergyTag and like still are, you know, heavily involved in it come from the regulated European system. We work really closely together, and you know, we've been definitely trying to help modernize the EU system. Our goal is not to replace the European Guarantee of Origin system. That is a regulated system in Europe. Our goal is to develop a set of, you know, voluntary standards that we hope can be used by the regulated system, and we've already seen that start, to be honest, in some of the regulatory updates that are, you know, being announced this month, to modernize and enable granular certification. So, you know, we're in regular contact with the regulators here in the European Commission to, you know, to keep them up to date of what we're doing, and hope that they can learn from what we're doing. Obviously, in other regions of the world, there's different types of regulatory setups. Some countries don't have REC systems. So that the effort to globally harmonize hourly tracking is obviously, in my view, is a useful one anyway. And where there's regulated systems, we're not here to replace those. We're here to help inform potential evolutions in those.
Okay, great. Thank you, Killian. And I think with that, we're going to shift to Neil. So I want to thank you for your insights and for sharing those slides. And yes, we will share the slides after the workshop, so everyone will have a copy of Killian's and Neil's slides. Neil, can you share your screen? And while you do that, I'm going to introduce Neil Fisher, who's a partner with the Northbridge Group. He provides economic and strategic consulting services. He's worked with clients to develop recommendations to modernize greenhouse gas accounting and reporting policies, evaluate emerging clean energy technologies, and achieve carbon-free procurement goals. We're really glad to have Neil here today to kind of pick up where Killian just left off and discuss data needs for tracking and accounting for emissions and some of the challenges associated with that data. So similarly to how we did with Killian, we're going to have some questions for Neil, and then we'll come back to the chat for your questions. So encourage you to continue submitting thoughts and questions in the chat. And with that, I will pose the first question, I think, to you, Neil, which is, what are the key ingredients for attributional hourly accounting?
Well, first, I want to thank RAP for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about this topic. And I also want to thank publicly Killian for the work that EnergyTag is doing to develop granular certificates, a really valuable decarbonization tool. A few weeks ago, a Bloomberg article stated that utilities and retailers hold the key to 24/7 carbon-free electricity, or CFE, and I really agree with this. And much of my career has been spent working with clients balancing supply with demand, either from a physical reliability or financial hedging perspective. And suppliers have been doing 24/7 for a long time just with fossil fuels. So to address climate change, we need to learn how to do this balancing with CFE resources in a reliable and affordable manner. And there are three main ingredients for doing hourly accounting, whether doing this for one large customer or thousands of customers. First, you need hourly consumption data. And two, you need hourly supply purchases or generation mix with a more granular market boundary. Three, you need hourly emissions factors if CFE does not fully cover the load. And there are three key metrics to know. The first two are measured in tons, the third a percentage. The first takes the black load line there and multiplies it by the hourly system average emissions factor. This is what is commonly called sort of the hourly scope 2 location-based inventory. And Greg Miller, who I believe is on this call, actually did a great paper comparing the difference between doing it annually or versus hourly. But this measures the emissions from consumption, assuming grid average emissions, what Killian was referring to as the grid mix. It ignores all procurement actions taken by the buyer. It ignores CFE claims of others on the grid, and it can be used to encourage load shifting and energy